Kazakhstan is an important country, believe it or not. It is 3 times zoned, 3,500 kilometers length and up to 2,500 kilometers in width. So it occupies huge territory. It is in the former Soviet Union, second largest country after Russia, and it's located between Russia and China. And to the south is a Muslim Central Asia, including Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. So the progress in Kazakhstan was significant since the independence. For the last 30 years, they more than doubled their GDP per capita. But there were issues, there were problems that people probably in the government were not addressing as much as they should have. And that is this stratification and polarization in terms of incomes. On the one hand, they had some very rich people. On the other hand, they had masses of people with minimal income of $100 a month. So whereas the average salary was $500 a month, the minimal income was $100 a month. And when the prices of liquefied petroleum gas that is used in transportation, mostly in some cases in heating, it gets really cold in the middle of the winter, people came out in the streets. And initially these protests were peaceful. And when they were peaceful, police went out to control the crowds, but they did not shoot, they were not even armed, they did not use tear gas or anything like that. But very quickly, the escalation happened. Some of the organizers were incited from abroad. There's some people who try to organize protests and topple the regime that are now live in comfortable exile in Europe, former bankers and whatnot. And then mobs came out and looting started, and people even attacked not just police headquarters, but even secret police headquarters. The KNB is a secret police. And the response initially, we're talking January 4th, 5th, was pretty weak. And the government, the president, decided, because of the weak response of the security forces, to call in CSTO. It's an organization that Russia leads and Kazakhstan was a member of, is a member of, and other countries are members: Belarus, Armenia, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, the neighboring 2 Central Asian countries. And as a result, over 2,000 soldiers were deployed in some crucial locations in Kazakhstan. So you had an escalation, you had insufficient response by the security forces and the police, which led to essentially internationalization of this conflict. So countries around Kazakhstan, like Russia and others, decided, based on the request of President Tokayev, to deploy limited forces. And by the way, these forces are already withdrawn from Kazakhstan. They did not stay there. They did not occupy the country. They came in an emergency and were quickly pulled out. Your question about the elites is very relevant, and it's a good question. So for almost 30 years, President Nursultan Nazarbayev, the first president, was the leader of Kazakhstan. In 2019, he was 79, I think. He stepped down, and new elections took place in which President Tokayev, the former prime minister, foreign minister, chief of staff for the president, took the lead and won the elections and became president. And for a period of time, President Nazarbayev, with the title of the first president, was a co-lead, if you wish. He did not intervene in day-to-day administration, but he was the head of the Security Council, the head of a political party, the ruling party, etc. So a lot of people in these protests were still blaming President Nazarbayev for the economic problems and whatnot. During the protests, President Tokayev assumed the leadership of the Security Council. And you mentioned the chief of the security service, Karim Masimov. He was arrested, and now there's an investigation. I believe he is accused of treason, but it's not in court yet. So there was a question mark, as we saw later, as people were laid off or fired. There was a question mark in the top echelons about the handling of these events, of the unrest. I believe the defense minister was let go, a couple of deputies to Karim Masimov and the security services were let go, but also at least 1/3 of the cabinet was not retained. Some people were retained, other people were not retained. But relative to other countries that I visited in Central Asia, Kazakhstan has a technocratic elite, pretty competent. There are issues, there are corruption, there are bureaucracy. Nobody's perfect. We in the United States are struggling with a lot of challenges here as well, and other countries do so on a day-to-day basis. But I think that the general direction of Kazakhstan's modernization, economic development, being a magnet for foreign investment in natural resources, but not only in natural resources, in services and financial services. In the middle of COVID, electronic banking system or electronic online bank called Kaspi had an IPO that was above $5 billion in Kazakhstan and London. So the country is modernizing. There are issues with income distribution, clearly. The issues with popularity of this or another leader or politician or technocrat, clearly. But overall, I think it was a stress test that together with COVID, this unrest that for a moment people in Kazakhstan thought things are really going south. So they had over 200 people killed in the unrest, including some law enforcement. They have, I believe, 2,000 people detained, and now they're sort of going through who did what, and a lot of people who were just arrested or detained in protesting were let go. So a small number, relatively, is now in detention, and they will be put on trial. And they are looking very carefully, who did what, and when, and how. And that is actually, if you compare it with European countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries. This is what governments do. Governments are there to maintain order. I don't think they're saying it all came from abroad, but there were things that I noticed. I've been to Kazakhstan several times and in other Central Asian republics. For example, the mobs in Almaty had prayer services outside, very unlike Kazakhstan. There are mosques and people go to mosques. Nobody limits that. But people were praying outside, and the question now is who was leading these prayers? Was religion weaponized? Some of Kazakhs and other Central Asians were fighting in Iraq and in Syria on the jihadi side and went back to Central Asia. Some of them went back involuntarily and are serving sentences for terrorism. But the question is, who else came back, who they didn't manage to catch, etc. So I think it's a question, and nobody's saying the majority of these protesters were jihadi or outside terrorists. What they do say, and what my contacts there, I called a bunch of people I know, what they're saying is there was also a criminal element. People were just looting. They were looting electronic stores, gun stores, jewelry stores. I have a colleague that just ran away from the mob. She said, I never ran so fast in my life in Almaty, in the largest city, when he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. So that also explains the reports of the shoot to kill order. When people are looting gun stores and taking out, I saw a number of over 1,000 of guns in one location in Almaty, like security service headquarters. The law enforcement needed to neutralize that threat. It does not mean that President Tokayev gave an order to shoot unarmed protesters. No, I followed it on the day-to-day basis. And when it started, Tokayev said, we will listen to the protest. He stopped that increase of the liquefied petroleum gas price. He froze prices on a number of other products. And that is interesting because to me, I'm a free market person. I like price deregulation, but any government has to have responsibility to its citizens and to law and order. If it's a trigger, if they didn't explain, if they couldn't handle, if it came as a surprise and they couldn't handle the explosion that this price increase triggered, then it was done wrong, right? You have to explain that you cancel a subsidy and maybe compensate the poorest part of the population. Look, if you have $3 a day to live on and have a family, this is very rough. There's no question about it. And I believe that they needed to do a better job before that price increase went in, better job in terms of explaining why they're doing it. And also in terms of law enforcement, there are numbers of 100,000 police in Kazakhstan. Yeah, it's 100,000 police in a country that is 3 times the size of Western Europe. So how many police we have in Western Europe? So that's the order of magnitude that they need to handle. Maybe one of the lessons is to train their police better, maybe to pay the police better, and to have a more calibrated response. Clearly not shoot to kill. I mean, that's not acceptable in any society. And also, look, any regime, any government needs legitimacy. A government that only relies on brute force loses its legitimacy. And I think Tokayev just formulated an interesting phrase. He said, one nation, different opinions. And before that, he said, the state that listens, the state that takes into account popular sentiment. That is important for President Tokayev, for the government of Kazakhstan, for that society. It's a rough history people have there. Remember, 100 years ago, this was mostly a nomad society. They had cattle. They moved from winter pasture to summer pasture, back and forth. Probably the majority of women were illiterate. And then the Soviet regime came. I mean, they were part of the Russian Empire before that. And then the Soviet regime started doing things that a lot of Kazakhs still believe were progressive. I believe educating women was progressive. But at the same time, they forced these nomads to stop traveling and to start doing collective agriculture that collectivized the flocks of animals, and it caused starvation. And the Soviets were absolutely brutal. And 1/3 of these peoples died, of peoples plural, because their tribal alliance is called the Zhuz, the three Zhuz, the big Zhuz, the medium, the middle Zhuz, and the small Zhuz throughout this whole area. And people went through a lot of brutalization by the Soviet regime. The Soviets also exploded 426 nuclear and hydrogen bombs in the testing ground on the territory of Kazakhstan. That is about 2,000 Hiroshima equivalents, Hiroshima bomb equivalents. 426 nuclear bombs. So you can say the country was nuked, right? Hundreds of thousands of people got cancer and radiation sickness and whatnot. So it's a harsh history that a lot of people don't understand or don't know. And now with oil and minerals and wheat, big producer of wheat, the country actually made a lot of economic progress. And the challenge for President Tokayev and his government, and for that society as a whole, is how to manage this modernization and path forward. We saw similar protests and challenges in other Asian countries that were modernizing a while back. Let's say South Korea, China, Japan, Indonesia. So in a way, it's not new. I'm not trying to diminish the suffering of the people, the tragedy of people being killed. I think the Kazakhstanis I know and talk to, they're shocked. They didn't expect this. They didn't see this coming. And this is policy-wise now, getting corruption under control, getting bureaucracy more responsive, getting the state that people feel is responsive, more responsive. That's a big challenge for them. Well, not only in Western media, mea culpa, I wrote a book called Russian Imperialism, Russian Imperialism, Development and Crisis. And honestly, I expected the CSTO force to stay. I think this is for credit of the Tokayev administration and the leaders of CSTO countries, that they did not behave as a Russian occupying force. The fact that this was a Russian force, clearly, Russia is the #1 military power in the region. They have, for example, the air transport, just like the United States in the NATO context, always provide the heavy lifting, the big airplanes to ferry troops. This was Russian planes, a Russian commander, but at the same time, you're right. This is, Armenia sent what, 100 people, Belarus sent 500. I think Kyrgyzstan was thinking for a very long time. And then, interestingly enough, and not CSTO member, non-member, a big neighbor to the east, China, after 2 days after the deployment said, oh, we would like to come and help too. And I think the Kazakh government and the rest said, thank you very much. Everything is under control. Call us later. No problem. Yeah, I expected that Russian and CSTO troops will stay for longer. The Kazakh security forces recovered, put the protest down. It is a tragedy. They recognize it's a tragedy. Since independence for 30 years, there were protests here and there. There were even occasional victims of law enforcement shooting people, but not on that scale. This was 10 times bigger than the biggest protest before. And everybody hopes, everybody recognizes that something happened that needs a consistent policy response. I think they're working on that. We will see how successfully. And they say the proof of the pudding is eating. If this does not come back, if it does not repeat itself, it means they're doing something right. If, God forbid, protests return in force, because it's very difficult to bring so many people out of poverty quickly overnight. Yeah, let's keep in perspective. The GDP per capita in Kazakhstan, median, is $9,000 a year. So that is less than $1,000 a month. But it's the social stratification, what is in business called the Gini coefficient, that is important here. So we hope, and I think that US, Mexico, which is a more developing, it's OECD country that went through not dissimilar, similar trajectory of a lot of poverty that government policies were trying to pull people out of poverty. So that's a key thing right now. And in my opinion, they have to keep an eye on radical Islamic preachers or cells or people who came back from the battlefields of the Middle East or studied in radical madrasas in Pakistan or India. They need to keep that in mind as well. So I talked about the Soviet regime before. Under the Soviets, so this was not independence, this was a government that was directed from Moscow. It was atheist, it was anti-religion. Religion was under a lot of pressure, but these are not Russians, these are not Slavs, these are not Christians. Culturally, religiously, this is very different than Russia. So that needs to be taken into account. The elites, most of the elites are either agnostic or not really heavily religious, but a lot of folks in the villages are. How do you balance that? How you let people practice their religion without the darkest forces, taking over, or darkest forces using a narrative that leads to violence? These are very challenging issues for any government. So I think we need to understand these challenges before we make judgments. But I also point out that Kazakhstan has hardworking people. They're pretty tolerant. 25–30% of the country speaks Russian. They have many different ethnic groups: Russians, Ukrainians, Koreans, some Germans who were exiled by Stalin, and others, over 100 ethnic groups. And these people live there without much suffering from ethnic violence or anything like that. So the potential is there. I think the investors can and should continue investing in Kazakhstan because of the economic perspective, economic horizon that includes exports to China, to the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Russia and other members of this economic bloc. So, as you said, it's not black and white at all. Kazakhstan was paying a lot of attention to the classic sort of liberal economic advice coming from Organization of Cooperation and Development, OECD, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc. I think the task of the Tokayev administration past the January events is to listen to the people as well, not just the economists who went to all the best schools like some of us and either stay in a nice hotel or live in a nice apartment and have everything taken care of, their healthcare, their pension, et cetera, et cetera. So I think they will be looking at investment, of course, keeping investment coming, but also addressing some of the excesses in terms of, for example, President Tokayev talked about fighting corruption in the customs, because when they bring trucks with goods from China, there were issues with the customs. So addressing that and also reducing some of the excesses from the corporations. And they created a social development fund called For Kazakhstan. And they appointed people who are trusted to manage the fund and told the companies, come and pay into the fund, and they will be using the proceeds to address some of these social issues. They also probably are going to change the taxation structure, maybe lighten the burden of taxation to the first quintile or two lower quintiles of the population. So there will be more proactive policies to fight poverty, to develop. And another thing in Kazakhstan, because some of the areas, more agricultural areas, more remote areas, some of these areas have inequalities relative to more prosperous capital or Almaty that I mentioned, where a lot of looting was going on, which is a big city with a business hub, the business center, the beating heart of business, I would say, in Kazakhstan. So they will be addressing that in order to level the differences in terms of regional inequality. They will continue training the younger generation. I always believe that improving education is very important, improving it in technical disciplines, but also in general modern economic disciplines. Our economy is developing so fast in terms of computers, in terms of information technology, AI. I do a lot of work in the renewable energy sphere. So these are new technologies that a lot of Kazakh expertise needs to be developed in. And I believe that this government needs to address it sooner rather than later. I do believe that looking from the outside, we tend to concern ourselves with the balance of power in Eurasia, what Russia will do, what China will do. But there's also intra-regional aspect that is very important. It started maybe 5 years ago, in which countries in the region are talking to each other and cooperating much more. The region is coming to its own. There is agency for the region. And the two leading countries are Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The others are either smaller or have internal problems, or like Tajikistan has Taliban as a neighbor. Turkmenistan is a separate story because of the government there. But Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan working together can pull that region up and make it modernizing, make it more attractive for investment, and frankly, in that case, more livable and more pleasant for its own population, for its own people. It is a fascinating area. It has East, it has West, it has modernity, it has history, beautiful nature, beautiful architecture. I strongly recommend to visit when things are quiet, and it looks like they're quieter now, or the unrest in Kazakhstan is over. I mean, it's pretty much done. The other problem they need to do, of course, deal with is COVID. But once all that goes away, it's a wonderful area to visit. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to get more content like this.